So I have Rainey Austin, the president of the agency, with me here today. Rainey, thank you so much for being here.
It's absolutely my pleasure. Thank you so much, Hannah.
And it is a turbulent time in the residential real estate markets for a number of reasons. The changes in commission structure based on the NAR settlement being one of them. So I wanted to start with, how are your agents reacting so far to this change?
Our agents are doing fairly well settling in.
Mhm.
We, of course, did set the stage for that for them. We started over 18 months ago, really getting them used to the idea, letting them know what was going to be coming down the path, even though we didn't know exactly what it was.
Yeah.
We knew that there were going to be changes, and so we started getting them used to some of the best practices that are in place now, so it doesn't seem so new to them. Part of the logic behind that was get people used to doing it when you don't have to do it, so that when you do have to do it, it doesn't seem so brand new. But with that said, I think all brokerages are really helping agents figure out how to navigate the changes that are happening. And even for those who are settled in, there's still, kicks and punches come around every corner. And so there's new opportunities to overcome obstacles every day.
Yeah, and it seems like there's an enormous amount of uncertainty really about what this settlement, what these changes mean. So can you just give me a little bit of background insight into what you guys at the agency are doing now to react to this, what you're talking to your agents about?
Absolutely. So there's two primary things that are happening. The first is essentially anyone who's a member of NAR. So a realtor, soon all real estate professionals come January 1st in the United States are going to have an agreement with their buyer in advance before touring them through a property or doing anything that requires a real estate license that has a compensation agreement. And so that's new. And then the second new thing is really more toward the idea and the side of communicating broker-to-broker commissions and the idea of not being able to do that over the MLS anymore and needing to have more clear, transparent negotiations with the consumer of all those parties. And so what we've been doing is really getting people used to how to have those conversations and agreements. The seller side is much easier than the buyer side for most people, and that really is just convincing or communicating the strategy to a seller. So it still is in your best interest to offer to consider, compensation. And the reason that that makes sense for a lot of people is most buyers can't necessarily afford to pay out-of-pocket compensation. And so that kind of goes back to the sort of buyer conversation that we're training our agents to have. And those conversations are more around, for the first time, they're being asked to sign an agreement up front before there's any property to, found or any negotiations happening, saying you're promising to pay me this amount. And that's a lot of unknown, a lot of uncertainty. And that makes some of our agents feel like, how do I sell them? How do I communicate that? And what we're trying to teach them is it's really no different than what you were doing with the sellers before, when you were going to the seller and saying, here's the agreement, and now I'm negotiating on behalf of myself and this potential buyer's agent and buyer who's coming. And so we've really tried to break it down to them so they can understand fundamentally it's a couple more conversations and a couple more forums, and this is what you need to know, and really trying to get them used to just those basic concepts. So really it's been more of a mindset and grounding exercise than a training exercise regarding the forums.
Yeah, what do you think the biggest sort of misconceptions are about these changes? Because there's just so much chatter, so much worry about having those conversations, about having the right forums, about interacting with your buyer or your seller in this new, different way. So what are sort of the biggest misconceptions, do you think?
The misconceptions and sort of this idea of like it's the Wild West comes from the fact that the rules that came out were about 80, maybe 90% clear, and the other 10 to 20% was left to interpretation. So inside of those misconceptions, you have a lot of brokerages who are saying, here's the best practice, and people are taking best practice as sort of a rule of thumb rather than a guardrail. And so like an example of that might be a best practice is to have a sign-up sheet for buyers when they come into a property, and to, if they don't sign that, you probably really shouldn't go over more than what's already on your flyer, so that you can make sure that you're not going outside of your boundaries. There are some agents who have taken that like to the letter, and it's like, well, if somebody comes in and doesn't happen to sign or refuses to sign, I have to exit them from the property, and like, do they have security so I can kick buyers out? And it's like, whoa, I think you're like missing the concept here, because they're so focused on, am I doing the right thing? And they're so afraid to do the wrong thing that they somehow misunderstand like where the gray areas are. And so one of the things that we're trying to focus on with agents is, here are the boundaries
Mhm.
so that you understand when a gray area comes up, what's the intent behind it?
Mhm.
And so they can make better informed decisions and be more strategic about
Yeah.
it. And so I think that a lot of the misconceptions just come from people probably who also are operating from, this is what I learned yesterday, but they haven't heard today's update with all the
Mhm.
things that are changing, or maybe aren't as in line with how that best practice or that new form is maybe not the best way to do it.
Mhm.
And they're still pushing forward with that as an absolute.
Yeah, one of the things that I think is interesting here is that even among brokers, there's a level of uncertainty where, certain brokerages have communicated, this is the way, this is the form. How are you dealing with that when your agents are, maybe on the other side of the table from an agent who kind of has a different perception about what these new rules mean?
That's a great question. Oftentimes for us, it's really about picking up the phone.
Mhm.
So one of the things we are really coaching and training our agents on, and even our managers, is when in doubt, pick up the phone.
Yeah.
Now it's actually an opportunity for us to come together as a community and
Mhm.
take care of each other. So one of the most common things that I think I've seen come across our desk is a buyer's agent will sit down with their buyer, and they'll come up with, X percentage or X number that's their compensation.
Mhm.
And then they will put an offer in on a property where a seller might be offering Y compensation.
Mhm.
And they'll write the offer saying, oh, we want that Y compensation. And then they submit their buyer compensation agreement, and it's for X.
Mhm.
And we're like, we'll have to pick up the phone and be like, you can't do that. And
Right.
so you could have your buyer counter that in as a concession, or as, an opportunity for you to maybe renegotiate your
Mhm.
contract with your buyer. But just, like, what you're doing right now isn't the right way of doing that. And so we're trying to take the high level of like walking people through if we
Yeah.
are seeing people have missteps. And usually it's really just picking up the phone, agent to agent or manager to manager, and we're able to get things solidified and sort of across the threshold to get the deal done.
Yeah.
But it is a little bit of like, well, I interpreted it this way, or I'm doing this, or even some brokerages, because the agents are so used to the way they've done it for 100 years.
Mhm.
And in order to have that conversation with their buyer or seller, they want a crutch. They want a form that says the
Mhm.
thing. And it's like, well, I want this form. And I'm like, but you realize that form isn't actually legally enforceable.
Right.
And they're like, yes, I know, but I
But
just want
it's a
it.
security blanket.
Yes. And so what we're also finding is our agents are like, well, okay, now I'm seeing this form and that form,
Mhm.
and from different brokerages where it used to be a little bit more uniform.
Mhm.
So it just takes another minute to understand. We're having the agents bring a lot of things to our managers, and they're saying, I haven't seen this one before, so I'm just checking with you. Are we supposed to do this? Are they, is the language that they're using here, or are there any liability for us? So people are just like uncertain, a little bit sort of hesitant. And so there's a little bit more, let me double check on that. But ultimately, it's not the end of the world. It really
Mhm.
is just kind of slowing the process a little bit and making people think twice about things,
Mhm.
not just where some of the uncertainty comes from. It's like people don't want to make a mistake. People don't want to do anything wrong.
Yeah.
And that gives them a little anxiety, and they're coming from that place of always wanting to do well and be well.
Yep.
And so it's really making them feel empowered and
Mhm.
supported inside of that. And that's what a lot of our efforts are, and internally at the agency.
One of the things I've been thinking about as well is how is sort of the layer of awkwardness that this might add into some of your conversation with your potential buyer who, you want to make the road as smooth for them as possible to find the house, close the deal, move into their new home. So wondering how you're sort of counseling people in those conversations, and then, whether or not you have seen that shift the dynamic between a buyer and a buyer's agent.
Yeah, I think one of the first things we're trying to do is get them to not see it as being awkward. And
Mhm.
so just getting them to get into the mindset of, was it awkward when you sat down with your seller to talk about it? It was like,
Mhm.
no, because we're used to doing that. Okay. Well, most of the buyers who are going through this, some maybe seasoned buyers who've gone through it a million times, but
Mhm.
even then, most people aren't buying all that often, right? It used to be
Yep.
the 7-year trend, and now it's more like 10 or plus years as people are moving in between, unless they're buying investment property.
Mhm.
So it's not like they're doing it every day like the way that you're doing it.
Sure.
I think what people are so concerned about is that with all the conversation in the media is that there's a big spotlight on it. It's not the
Mhm.
fact that it's negotiable, because quite frankly, as we know, it was always negotiable,
Mhm.
but there was a standard of care that people just leaned into. And
Mhm.
it was like, well, this is what you paid me because this is what everyone gets paid.
Yep.
And it might have been like a variance of like a negotiation from like this to this.
Mhm.
Now the opportunity, how we're trying to get people to see it is, you're going in there, and I know it's like showing your values, this big cliche, but the agents who are doing the best are the ones who feel most confident and strongest in being able to have those conversations, because they realize that every day as an agent, you have conversations, you're selling yourself, you're selling the property, you're always in a negotiation conversation. This is no different than that. So as long as you can like ground yourself in like, you're super skilled in that. Like that is your job. That's what you do all the time.
Yeah.
And now you're going in and you're doing that with your buyers. And in many cases, we had so many agents who are working for buyers for sometimes years without compensation, and then in these hot markets would go ahead and put an offer in with like the listing agent because they somehow thought that was going to get them a better deal or get them in these competitive markets. And so now we're trying to get people to see like this is actually for your best interest and for the buyer's best interest. Like now you guys know up front the clarity around that. So when people can understand that it's a win-win for everyone and that the intentions behind things are actually good, you know, judgment aside on whether or not how it was implemented and executed was the best way, I think that just the general sentiment behind it can be a positive. And if you focus on that, you can have success.
Right. And it does seem that it gives you this opportunity to sell yourself, as you said. Maybe it's a cliche, but to prove your worth. And I would imagine that those, you know, real expert agents, I mean, in the luxury sector, lots of times people were negotiating this at the top with buyers already.
Absolutely.
It's not new, and it gives some of those folks, even, you know, who maybe aren't at the luxury level, this chance to say, here's my worth, and this is what I think you should pay for it. So have you seen folks, you know, sort of empowered by that, taking advantage of it and being able to sell buyers on their worth as an agent?
Our best agents are actually loving it.
Yeah.
A lot of them are reveling in the opportunity to go out there and set themselves apart. We have examples of agents who've gone in and maybe almost doubled what they would have gotten traditionally because they're able to say, look, I have a unique history with this property, or I have an in with this seller. And if you want to set yourself apart, and if I present this offer for you, you're more likely going to get it and get a better, you know, net deal for both parties inside of it. And when you have that unique expertise, like you should be paid for that. And so now they don't feel handcuffed by these pre-existing conditions. On the other side of the spectrum, you also, as always, have people who are coming in who maybe are the more like discount brokerages who are coming in and with any opportunity. We've seen this before. In many cycles, they're trying to come in and undercut and say, while there's a spotlight on what commissions are being paid, I'm going to come in and I'm going to try to make it a commodity. And then what my sort of anticipation around that, it's too early to tell, but we've seen this cycle come through multiple times. Consumers tend to have that experience, and then they realize that wasn't the greatest experience, and then they end up going back to a full service agent. It's kind of like for any of us who ever booked that like slightly cheaper hotel, and then you go and you get there and you're like, yeah, I'm never doing that again.
Yeah, the slightly worse flight, that's the dramatically worse experience.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so we've found that consumers really understand that they get what they pay for. And when you're talking about negotiating something of this caliber, which for many is, we often say it's the largest purchase of their lifetime, incrementally so as they continue to buy up and do other things, it's really important that you have a trusted advisor, and that person should be paid what they're worth. And if they are everything they promise to be in your value, you will get that value out of them, from negotiations to getting off-market listings or any sort of hidden inventory. Their resources, their knowledge, their expertise of negotiating all help you in your final position as a buyer. And the same holds true for those who are representing sellers.
Yeah, it seems to me, and we spoke about this before, that there are some winners who are going to emerge from this opportunity or requirement to bring more transparency into their contracts, into their negotiations, and some losers too. Is that fair to say? Could you define who you think some of those people would be for me?
That's a great way of looking at it. So there's always winners and losers in any situation. I agree with that. I would say that the winners are going to continue to be those who are good salespeople, good negotiators, those who understand their value and feel confident in demonstrating that. And quite frankly, those who are bold enough to go out there and ask for something, knowing that they might fail at it. It's Mauricio, our founder of our company, The Agency, always says you have to dare to be bad in order to be great. And I think that applies to our agents as well, which is like you have to dare to go out there, play in the sandbox, try new things. During this time when things are shifting, you can like really find a path along the way if you're able to be confident and bold and not get caught in the fear. The losers, unfortunately, I think ultimately are some of like the buyers and the even like first-time home buyers, quite frankly. There's not been a lot of them because most sellers see the value in offering out compensation, or at least a consideration for compensation. But I have heard of a few instances where somebody will be working with a buyer's agent. They have a signed buyer broker agreement. They'll go to a seller and the seller refuses. Even if their deal is net better for the seller, they're just like fundamentally not happy with this arrangement. And then they've actually had to walk away from a property that they would have been more qualified for and would have gotten in the old system. And I think there's like frustration inside of that, particularly when I think the intent behind these changes with transparency was to really help the home buyers particularly, and quite frankly, I think in many cases is actually hurting them. And then certainly the newer agents who are coming into the market who maybe aren't as confident in their skills and aren't as practiced in their skills. But there are some who are coming in and just nailing it because they have that innate sort of fire and boldness and confidence, and they're leveraging that to their abilities, and they're having great successes. You're seeing people hit it out of the park already.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, we're in this turbulent time. There's this big spotlight on the residential brokerage industry right now, both from the attention and from the big picture rule changes. What do you hope will come out of this?
I'm hoping that ultimately there's big picture and small picture things that happen. I'm hoping that agents are able to kind of ground themselves inside of the change and are able to see that it really is a few revised contracts, a few new forms, and having to pick up the phone a couple more times and really see the opportunity inside of this in terms of the transparency and ability to negotiate and for them to step up and excel. So from the overall perspective, I'm really hoping that this allows really amazing agents to rise and shine, and those who aren't making it to sort of make their exit. And I'm hoping that that helps us to elevate the industry so that we can be seen as professionals, which we are, and not akin to used car salesmen sometimes and some of those other analogies that you hear out there. And also for home buyers and sellers to really see the value that agents bring to the table. I think that there's been a narrative out there, and I've always been a supporter of platforms like Zillow and others who have brought technology into the industry, but there's been this concept that real estate agents can be replaced. And I think that this is another example of the fact that they can't, and there is value, and now the value is actually like more negotiable and transparent. Maybe people can actually see, well, I think it was homes.com printed like a sheet that said, like, here's the 114 things I'm going to do to help you as a buyer, help you sell your home. There's a lot that goes into it that we try to make invisible for this consumer experience. But as you're starting to try to demonstrate your value, maybe more of that will become better understood and better valued and more appreciated.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Randy Austin, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you.